Hey, U.S. Sister students, hope you're doing well today. Sorry I'm not able to be with you. Wanted to give you just a real quick overview of a couple of aspects of the 1920s. If you were there yesterday, you watched what I thought was a really good video that covered a lot of the social things, cultural, economic with technology, and a little bit of political, not much. Today, what I want to do is kind of give you a very broad question to think about with your study of Roaring Twenties when I'm not there, and then next week I'll be back for a few days to walk through this with you in some more detail. But anyway, but what I would like to do is kind of get you thinking about how was the Roaring Twenties an era that was defined by cultural things, social things, economic slash technological things, and also political to a large extent. Um, and the reason I bring that up is some of these trends are what I call similar to what we've studied, like is the Roaring Twenties, if you want to look at it economically, another quote unquote industrial revolution in a sense. And this is where not everybody is in agreement with saying it's a third industrial revolution. The reason being is because we've had new technology before. Of course, this technology will change. So, anyway, you can think about that on your own. And the other thing about it is there's a lot. I think there's a lot of things that link the Roaring Twenties in a pop culture way that probably make this a time period that's more applicable than maybe some of the other ones that we've done in a sense. So that broad question is, I think, worth at least thinking about. How is it still impacting the nation? Of course, we know that toward the end of 1920, or at least 1920 moving forward, you have one of the more important amendments, not that all of them aren't important in their own way, that's going to, again, extend more suffrage and voting to women. And that's pretty significant, obviously. Why do I bring this up? Well, let's take a look really quick at political history. So, if you recall from World War One, Woodrow Wilson does not run for a third term. He has that pretty significant stroke. And the result of that is, and I don't know if he would have ran again, but it'd be interesting to see it, his health held up, what might he have done. But 1920 is one of those really important elections. This is where we start to look at the first post-World War period in American history, political, etc. And so you have several candidates that come out of the woodwork, and the one that stands out the most is Warren G. Harding. He's a Republican. Keep in mind, all three presidents that'll be between Wilson and FDR are Republican presidents. And he's going to make a really catchy slogan slash phrase that is going to be called, is going to be called, for the most part, return to normalcy. And so what does he basically do? He says, okay, we need to get the country back into a state of peace. Transition. There's a process called reconversion where we're going from a state of war to a state of peacetime economy. And like we talked a little bit about during World War One, that takes planning. It also takes time, and we'll look at that. There are a lot of pros with that. There's also some potential downsides. So that's going to be the big focus politically, is how does he and Calvin Coolidge after him, and also Herbert Hoover, who has the untimely presidency that is only about, 7, 8 months old, something like that, when the stock market formally crashes and the Great Depression becomes pretty big with him. We'll start to look at that more next week as we transition to the causes of the Depression, the effects, and then also the FDR New Deal. But politically, what you look at with this time period is you're looking really at a presidency that kind of explores the idea of having a more laissez-faire economic policy. And I think you all are pretty familiar with that term from the Gilded Age. Historians debate, is it 100% accurate to call it laissez-faire? Well, the one thing that we notice is that the government is going to kind of revert back somewhat to the idea of less of an involvement, more hands-off, as laissez-faire alludes to. So the one thing that we have to keep in mind is that that is very much going to be a signature point of Harding, but I would argue more particularly Calvin Coolidge as well. Um, Coolidge is going to take over, just by the way, after Harding suffers a heart attack um, and actually dies about 2 years into his term. And there's debate about how that heart attack happened. I won't get into that too much. But the one thing I want you all to keep in mind is that Coolidge is going to be in office for about 6 years. He's elected to a full term in 1924. And, of course, he's going to be pretty well known. And he kind of just lets the country move forward. There's not a ton of foreign policy that happens under him, but there are a few details we'll talk about in a second. And then, of course, like I said a moment ago, you have that transition to Hoover that's more associated with the Great Depression. As far as foreign policy for these presidents, Harding starts the country into this direction of more, I guess the best term, although it's probably not the 100% correct, is what historians call isolation. We do sign several separate peace treaties with Germany and Austria-Hungary. We do not ratify Versailles, keep in mind. And so technically, as far as we're concerned, our war with them is over. But we are not going to be an active member of the League of Nations or a member at all, keep in mind. That's a big deal because we know that post-World War II, the UN is going to take place of the League. And as you all, I think, know, the United States will be heavily involved in the UN, but we will not be with the League, which is interesting given the fact that it was very much driven by President Wilson. The other thing militarily that's going to drive the U.S. foreign policy is going to be a policy of disarmament. And I won't go into all the details, but you notice a series of treaties that are signed in the earlier 1920s under Harding. There's a Washington Disarmament Conference where a bunch of countries attend, and not all of them certainly are going to be on board around the world with the idea of disarmament. But the basic nuts and bolts of disarmament, guys, for the most part, is that disarmament is reducing military size. There's a story about the United States trying to disarm and reduce the naval size and actually destroying a lot of our ships and basically sinking them. To some people, that was a good idea. Sends the message that we're not as likely to be involved in war moving forward. However, the downside of that, if you think about it, is what happens if you have another world war or another conflict in general. So that's the other side. So that's the presidency in a nutshell. Now, major issues that are going to define the political atmosphere, if you will, or culture of the United States. Keep in mind, World War I, you see a very big focus on nativism, like we talked about. And this is going to make a lot of Americans very skeptical. You have that Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that eventually is going to institute communism. Socialism is gaining ground. And so there's a big focus on kind of like this reaction or resistance to radical ideas. At least that's what a lot of people would deem them to be. So what happens? You have this first Red Scare. We don't call it a first Red Scare then because we don't have a second one post-World War II. However, the same idea is true. Okay, so Americans start to become kind of skeptical of people from Russia, people from Italy that are, supporting more socialist ideals. And so the first Red Scare leads to a couple of events that are pretty important. One of which I think your reading talks about in some depth, the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer thought it would be a really good idea to try to, I guess you could say, preemptively try to get rid of people that were sympathetic to communism and radical ideas. What he does is he makes it, pretty much clear that they will kind of invade people's homes and things like that if you're suspected. Now, as you can imagine, there are going to be some people that are pretty upset about that because they feel like their constitutional rights are being intruded upon. And there are going to be some court cases which we won't go into, but Another thing that happens is, again, this nativism that continues to gain ground. You're going to have several acts that are passed, quota acts, if you want to look at it like that, that basically put strong quotas, especially on people that would be entering the country from Eastern and Southern Europe. So places like Greece, places like Italy, places like Russia, Hungary, Hungary, etc. Okay. One big thing happens that I think is important, and that is the Sacco-Vanzetti trials. These two men, as their name suggests, had Italian roots. They were anarchists, so they were deemed to be, again, radical, not supporting really law and order, you could say. And what happens is that there's a murder that happens, and the argument is these two men were kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Looking back on it, most people that I've read would say that they probably did not have the due process that should have been afforded to them. They were tried, convicted, and then later on they were put to death. So a lot of people think that they were targeted mainly because of the immigrant background and the radical ideals that people associated them with. Okay, so that's kind of a big deal. Scandal-wise, and this is something that we talked about during the Gilded Age, you're going to see some of this in the 1920s. I won't say too much about this because of time, but Warren G. Harding, his administration, has one big scandal, several that stand out, but one big one, and that is the Teapot Dome. You can research it on your own, but that creates, as you can imagine, a lot of stress for his administration. And some historians would argue that the stress of that is eventually what led to him having health problems and eventually passing away in office. And then last but not least, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on protecting American business. We talked about that during the Gilded Age, where people are very committed to the idea of higher tariffs. And you notice this in the 1920s. Toward the end of the 20s, actually in 1930, when the Depression is going on, we'll come back to this next week, Hoover makes a decision to actually go and support what became known as the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which was a high protective tariff. The problem with that is that you're basically going to lose a lot of world trade. Why? Because pretty much the worldwide depression is called that for a reason. Okay, but that's an issue we'll look at more next week. Now, economically, with the 1920s, this is an era that probably most of you would have found perhaps the most interesting in the video yesterday that you watched. Okay, you have a lot of new technology. You have a focus on, if you think consumerism was somewhat emphasized prior to World War One, post World War One, 1920s, this is where you really get into that time period of consumerism. If you look at one of the slides in the slideshow that I posted, you'll notice that you see even the furthering of the flight by the famous Wright brothers, the movie camera, and then the thing is that hey, you're moving people are moving, into the urban environments more. So you're seeing a transition from rural to urban, but you still have a fairly decent sized population in rural areas. And so they figure out when they start to put all these new stores together, like these department stores that we'll come back to in a second, it's like, hey, we have people that we can actually send mail order catalogs to, and they'll actually buy our products. So you're going to actually be using some of this in the next activity that you do to actually try to put yourself in the position of people marketing this kind of product, these new things like the electric coffee pot and the washer dryer, the radio, even you'll see this in a moment if you choose to look at the website, but even Sears, believe it or not, actually sold Sears, what they called Sears Craftsman houses. And and if you go to the website and look at them and see what they look like, it's actually kind of neat to see, one, just how much you could get for a relatively small amount of money, although back then, keep in mind, that was a much different amount. and so forth. So kind of a neat little thing to keep in mind. Probably the biggest economic figure of this time period is going to be, of course, the infamous Henry Ford. Right, we've all heard of him. We've heard of Ford, still a very important company. Henry Ford is an interesting guy as far as the economic culture is concerned, and a lot of that goes back to that. Believe it or not, he was very, very generous to his workers. Paid them $5 a day. He believed that and that was actually a very solid wage. You all might be saying, well, isn't minimum wage today over $7 an hour? Yes, it is. $4.25 when I was y'all's age, by the way, back in 1991. But the one thing that you notice is that Ford understood that if you can keep these people fairly happy, you're going to have a lot less turnover. You're going to be able to basically keep people that are able to do the jobs. We'll get to the assembly line concept in a moment. And he also believes, and this is kind of interesting, that your workers should also be able to be your consumers. So if you're paying them, they're going to be able to afford your product, which is kind of cool because they'll be buying from you and the money of the company will be continuously circulating within the company, right? So you could argue they get a good fair wage and you get, money in return for the product. And so he basically figures out that if you can also reduce the cost of production, then you're going to be able to also pass that on to the consumer and reduce price. So he does. So this assembly line. Now, one thing to keep in mind, he is not the inventor of the assembly line concept. That was a gentleman, I think his name was Frederick W. Taylor, way back when. But what Ford does is he kind of adapts this to his own, use with the car industry, and it's effective. If you looked at the video, you notice that, he was pretty, he was pretty one-sided with this. One car, you could get it in one color, very, it wasn't really flashy, and then he has competition later on. The idea of, another company that's making cars that have different colors, and the interior has different kinds of leather and all this. And that's a good thing. It makes competition. And again, if you're a free market person, you think that competition can drive better, products and so forth. Okay. And so important for you all to keep that in mind. So Ford is able to reduce the production of the car substantially. And of course, the cost is also going to be pretty substantial. Okay. As far as the amount that it changes. So that's a pretty important thing. The assembly line, honestly, was not what I would consider to be the most fun work. It wasn't really designed to be. I mean, you're doing one task for a continual 8 hours. He was also very generous with the time he had his people work and things like that, keep in mind. Okay, which kind of brings us to our last big theme of economics, and that is the continued rise of this consumer culture. Keep in mind, for about a year and a half or so, Americans are rationing. They're not encouraged to really do a whole lot of things outside of buying war bonds and being mindful with the food they're eating and things like that. Well, as you transition to about 1921, 1922, the culture, sorry about that, my aunt's cell phone just went off, is actually going to be something that we notice that's pretty important. Okay, so something that you want to definitely keep in mind. Sorry about that, guys. I had to move for a moment. Is the idea of the rise of what you and I would consider to be the department store, Macy's, Sears and Roebuck, etc. Okay, so consumerism, guys, keep in mind. I think that term is defined in your course guides. Okay, But something for y'all to keep in mind with that is you're really looking at the idea of buying things that are not of necessarily necessity, right? So you're not going out to just buy a gallon of milk or something like that, okay? Um, and so the big thing that drives a lot of this is the easy credit and also the installment plan buying, okay? So one thing for you all to keep in mind is that easy credit is going to allow people to buy things that they really probably don't need, but that they think are necessary to make life easier or whatever, okay? And that's where also the installment plans come into it, okay? So, let's say you're going to buy a washer or dryer or whatever that would be like $50. Keep in mind the average American, is not making, probably that much, per week, okay? So why is that a big deal? All right, it's a big deal because these people want to buy these products, and so they're going to buy them over the course of time. So let's say you have an installment plan to buy it over 12 months, 24, 36. These people are going to be in a position where they can actually do that. Okay. You take a look at the next slide, you'll notice that GDP, which is gross domestic product. An easy way to look at that is that's the total output of goods and services in a given year in a nation that's produced. That number, as you can see, between about 1922 and around 1929 goes up dramatically. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Okay, there is some downsides of some of this economic activity, and that is, like in the Gilded Age, we talked about the expansion or disparity between the rich and the poor. There's a slide there that shows you that, okay? And I won't say too much about that, but something to definitely keep in mind, okay? You can make the argument that these economic trends kind of put people in a position to think that they actually don't, that they can afford things that they really ultimately couldn't. Okay. Those of you that are thinking, well, is this kind of the same idea as a credit card? I would say it's very similar, although the concept of the modern credit card, the way we think of it, the instant plastic, if you will, doesn't come around until really post-World War II, probably late 40s, early 50s. Okay. I want to direct you to your last slide here. Okay. Not last slide, but the last one that says points about the 1920s economy. And if you're kind of thinking, okay, well, what all did people buy as far as credit and installment plan buying? The answer is almost everything that you can imagine. Okay? And so what I want you to think about, all right, and I realize this video is a little bit longer than my other ones, so I apologize for that, is I want you to think about how there's a connection to modern advertising. You have a lot of celebrities, a lot of people in the 1920s that we'll look at more Friday, actually. Okay, I'll do a video for you then. And, some of these people you've heard of. You've heard of probably Babe Ruth. You've heard of, Louis Armstrong. You've heard of Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh. The list goes on and on. Okay, and these are all people that you would notice in the news quite a bit. They would be, for sports stars or pop culture or music or whatever, okay? And what the 20s advertising figures out is that you can appeal to people's emotions. Sound familiar? Probably does, okay? And that you can attach these celebrities to their products. And people are going to be like, hey, we can afford it, because these people, it makes them look cool. Remember in the 1980s, when I was 11, I think it was 1986, whenever, the Michael Jordan Air sneaker came out, and I'm like, Mom, I gotta have one of those. And I was completely under the assumption that if I wore those shoes, I would be able to jump out of the gym. Now, when I got to be about 18, I can occasionally, dunk a, tennis ball. Don't ask me to do that now. But the point is that it kind of makes people feel attached to a product because there's a celebrity and what you associate with them. What I want you to do, okay, is I want you to go to that Sears and Roebuck website, and I want you to look at that. Okay, just browse it over for a few minutes, look at the different houses, etc. Okay. Second thing I'd like for you to do is there's a little video that I posted on the modern version of an athlete. Back in the day, Jim Thorpe was kind of like this model of modern athletes. In the late 80s, we have one named Bo Jackson. You don't have to watch the whole video, but watch how he excelled at both baseball, football, and then there's a very short segment of how Nike, right, of course, a famous shoe company, is going to use him to kind of market their product. There's an activity that you'll start today and probably finish Friday that is actually going to kind of have you create your own advertisement page using several of these things. You can pick any product from the 20s that you want. You can pick any celebrity from the 20s that you want. But you want to be able to research, what else? Oh yeah, you want to be able to research as best you can prices. Now here's the thing. My suggestion to you for prices: find a modern store, Walmart, etc. Okay, and let's say you're going to do the electric coffee pot or something. Okay, and find the price and use the converter to actually convert that price back in the 1920s. Now you're going to have to make sure that you market this product by using easy credit, and you have to give the buyer installment plans. Now, some of you are going to be like, well, this is only going to cost $5 back then. Okay, doesn't matter. You still have to be able to appeal to the people to buy something over the course of time that they probably wouldn't have had the money back then to do outright. Okay, on Friday, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to finish up that project. Okay, submit it to Canvas in either Word or PDF form. I do not want you to use PowerPoint. I want you to use something that allows you to use a full page kind of advertisement. Okay, you can get creative as you want, but it needs to obviously hit the guidelines of that. You're going to upload that to Canvas. I'm also going to give you a video to watch Friday. I'm going to do about a 20-minute introduction to social cultural things, and I'm going to have you watch a video on the culture side of the 20s and some of these things that are popping up that show some of the disagreement. Hope you're doing well. Obviously follow the directions of the substitute, and I will see you as soon as I can. Thank you.